Oh, good morning, Protege. Of course, good afternoon to my wonderful eighth period class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is going to be my next direct instructional Zoomcast, and it's going to be for Friday. Thank gosh, everybody. And it's October 15th, 2021. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. So I'm going to share my screen with everybody. And at this point, what I would like everybody to now do is I'd like you to skip a full page in your ISNs. And I would like everybody to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. There we go. Perfect. All right. Make certain that everybody has dated your notes for today. It is October 15th. And what you're going to do is you're going to write down for me your first topic heading, which is we're going to watch a video clip, and it's on the stock market during the Roaring Twenties, the 1920s. Write that down. So before we get started, by the way, anybody who has a water bottle, why don't you uncap your water bottle, briefly remove your mask, take a big swig of water. Cheers, everybody. You got to keep your brains and your bodies hydrated in order for you to function properly and think lucidly, clearly, and saliently. All right. So before we go into the guide questions, there's a reminder to you. So what's the stock market? So the stock market, again, primarily located in New York City, New York Stock Exchange, the buying and selling of shares or stocks in different companies or corporations. Again, if you own more than 51% of the stocks in a company, you are the majority owner of the company, and you're calling the shots. When you're buying a stock or a share in a company, you're buying, again, a piece of the company. The more shares you own, the more greater control, the greater say-so you have. Now, remember, when you buy stocks in a company, it is a classic risk-reward situation. The risk is if the company does well, you could lose a lot of money. The reward is if it does really well, you can make a lot of money. And remember, during the Roaring Twenties, much, not all, but much of the Roaring Twenties, you experience in the stock market what we call as a bull market. A bull market is when the value of the stocks consistently keeps going up. A bear market is when the value of the stocks consistently goes down. So that's why in the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, everybody was buying stocks because they thought it was the best way of getting rich. It was their lottery ticket, okay? But here's the problem, though, with the thought process before I give you the guide questions. So the question I think I said last time is, so when's the best time to buy stocks? Should you be buying stocks or shares in a company when the market is down in a bear market or when it's up in a bull market? And the answer is it's best to buy stocks in a bear market. Why? Because you're buying the stocks for a lower value. And then invariably, the stock prices are going to start to go up. Now, on the other hand, if you're buying stocks in a bull market where the value of stocks is up, eventually they're going to come down and you're going to end up losing money. There's an old saying, because I do the stock market all the time. I've been buying stocks now for almost 30 years. And the old saying is, you buy low and sell high. The problem with a lot of people in the Roaring Twenties is they're going to be buying way, way, way too high at inflated prices, and then they're going to be forced to sell low, and they're going to be losing a lot of money. So let's get into our guide questions. You guys know the drill. I'm going to go through these quickly. Anytime you need to. The beauty of these Zoomcasts is you work at your own pace, and that's why I love these Zoomcasts so much. If I'm going too fast, pause it. Here we go. Number one. So the first guide question I want you to look for in this video clip is, how did World War I benefit the American economy? Skip a line or two between the guide questions. That's where you're taking in your notes. Here we go. Number two, next guide question. What goods did American industry produce in the 1920s? This actually is going to be a nice segue into what I'm going to be talking about in my direct instruction today. Number three. As consumerism increased, what did more Americans use to buy goods? Consumerism, consuming, taking in, buying. Always remember, when you're looking at a word, look at the root word, consumer. We're all consumers. We all consume things, buy things. Whether it's a new phone, iPhone, whether it's a new TV, or maybe some new clothes. What helped contribute to the to the collapse, I should say, of the stock market? That's going to be in October. In October, this month, way back in 1929. So you're now looking at almost the 100th anniversary. So about 92 years ago. And finally, what was, I should say, Black Tuesday? All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get into our video clips. So this video clip is about 3 minutes and 10 seconds long, and I'll make some comments and observations once you're done viewing it and taking your copious notes. Here we go. The stock market during the roaring 1920s. Good luck, everybody.
Shortly after the First World War, many countries and economies were in the process of being rebuilt. A lot of America's economy at the time was built by trades with Europe. As the United States had not suffered any damage from World War I, they had goods that European countries needed, but could no longer produce for themselves. America's economy was booming as the age of prosperity commenced, and factories began manufacturing new technologies such as the automobile and household appliances. As the industrialization era was at an all-time high, people were wealthy enough to splurge money on new gadgets to better their lives. At this point, consumerism was growing at a tremendous rate. With the rise of consumerism, the economy was doing great, and banks began introducing the idea of buying on credit, buy now, pay later. This idea changed the way in life for many Americans as the automobile, washing machines, vacuums, and many more appliances were now affordable for everyday people and not just the rich. During all this prosperity, the stock market was reaching all-time highs, which encouraged more people to invest and caused the stock market to rise even more. More and more people began to invest their money in the stock market as a way to get rich quick, but sadly most of the money that was invested was credit money, which largely contributed to the collapse of the stock market in 1929. On October the 24th, 1929, the day which later became known as Black Thursday, investors began to sell all their shares in panic as the market shares began to decline due to stocks reaching their peak value. This day marked the beginning of the end. Due to the decline of market shares, many people were trying to cash in while they could still make a profit, but unfortunately, there were more sellers than buyers and people were unable to cash out. On Black Tuesday, October the 29th, 1929, the stock market had collapsed due to plummeting stock prices. Billions of dollars of investors' money was lost that day, and due to people's ignorance of the credit system and the fact that there was no limit on how much money people could borrow, many investors were drowning in debt and had no way to pay back the money to the banks. This sparked one of the world's worst depressions and caused many banks to permanently shut down due to having virtually no funds.
So a couple of takeaways. Number one, and I'm going to definitely spend a lot of time, once we're done with the Roaring Twenties, talking about the collapse of the stock market in 1929, which was the biggest factor which contributed to, as the narrator mentioned, to the Great Depression. So a couple of takeaways. Number one, so again, I don't want anybody coming away thinking that buying stocks is a bad thing. I've been buying stocks since the mid-90s. The problem is that when people in the Roaring Twenties were buying stocks, I mean, they were putting all their money into the stock market and really not setting any money aside in the banks to save for paying their bills, because they thought that the stock market would keep going up and up and up, and they would continue to keep making lots and lots of money. That was mistake one. Mistake number two was a lot of people were engaging in what's called buying on margin. Buying on margin, which I will be teaching about when we get to the Great Depression and the stock market crash, is when people were borrowing money to buy stocks. Now, the problem is you're borrowing money and you have no money in the bank because you're putting all your money in the stock market. But how are you going to eventually pay those loans back if the stock market starts to go in the opposite direction and become a bear market? So they mentioned Black Thursday, and then several days later, Black Tuesday, when the stock market completely collapsed. And so what happens is people literally in a couple of days lose all their money. Everything is wiped out. And then what happens is then the banks are coming and knocking on your door and saying, hey, you owe me $10,000 you took out on a loan to buy stocks. That's called buying on margin. And you go to the bank and you say, I don't have the money. I have all the money in the stock market, and the stock market just collapsed. And the bank just says, well, that's fine. I have to foreclose. I have to take your house over. And you're going to hear more of this when we really get into the Great Depression in a couple of weeks. It truly, when you look at the Roaring Twenties and the way it was set up, you know, the end of World War I, again, our manufacturing industry was booming. Europe needed our goods as they were rebuilding from the Great War. It really was a perfect storm, the way the decade set up. And then when the decade comes to a close with the stock market crash, it was again a continuation of this perfect storm. All right, here's what I'd like you guys to do. I'd like you to skip a full page. You're going to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Make certain that, again, you date your notes for today. It is October 15th, 2021. And of course, it's Friday. All right, and then up on the overhead screen, you're going to write down for me the Roaring Twenties. So now I'm going to get into more direct instruction. So again, this is the 100th anniversary this year, because remember, a decade starts not on a 0, but a decade technically starts on the 1. So this is the 100th anniversary of the Roaring Twenties, a truly remarkable decade as we're finding out. All right, so what's happening? So here's another economic change. You would write this down. So the biggest change, of course, is the stock market. So it wasn't just the wealthy folks that were heavily investing in the stock market. Everybody was investing in the stock market. Housewives were investing in the stock market because everybody thought that was the best way of getting rich quickly. So here's another huge change that you didn't see earlier. And this huge change is more and more Americans are buying consumer goods. They mentioned in the video, refrigerators, washing machines, sewing machines. But now what's happening is more and more Americans are not paying cash. What they're doing is they're buying these goods on credit, using credit cards, Visa, MasterCard, American Express. You know, the old adage of buying now and then paying it off later. Now, there's nothing wrong with using credit and credit cards. I use them all the time. But when the monthly bill comes in, you got to pay that whole thing off in full, because if you don't pay it off in full, then you start paying interest on the money you took out, and that starts to build up after a while. But again, if in the 1920s you're using credit to buy goods and you're not saving any money at all because you're putting all your money in the stock market, question, how are you going to pay back your credit card bills if the stock market starts to go in an opposite direction and becomes a bear market? You see how this is all tying together? It truly was a perfect storm. All right, please write this down. So I want to talk about problems for American farmers. So if you direct your attention up to my screen, that of course is American Gothic. It's located in the, of course, Art Institute in downtown Chicago, which Mrs. Bonk and I were members of for many, many years. Mom and Pa farmer are not real happy. And they shouldn't be in the Roaring Twenties, because the Roaring Twenties might have been a fun time to live in terms of pop culture. And if you were invested in the stock market in the early middle part of the decade, but it wasn't necessarily a great decade for the farmers. Now, the question is why? All right, let's talk about this. So what was going on at this point? So if you go backwards a little bit, go back to the start of World War I, the Great War, which we'll be learning about after Thanksgiving break. World War I starts in 1914. We, the United States, don't enter World War I until 1917. But those war years were very, very good years for American farmers. They were doing extremely well. And the question I have is why? So I'd like you to draw a line off to the side. You're going to add what's called an oral side note. And the answer is simple. Because not only are American farmers growing crops, growing food for the American people, they're also growing food for our allies in Europe. So again, you're being able to ship your wheat or your barley or your corn over to Europe because they need our crops. They need our food because they're fighting the Great War. So let's say, for the sake of conversation, you were normally selling a bushel of wheat or a bushel of corn for $1 a bushel. Now you're selling it for $5 or $10 a bushel. So you are making great money. Now, if you would write this down, but all good things have to come to an end. So now by the mid-1920s, like 1923, 1924, 1925, 1926, what you notice for American farmers is the price of crops starts to begin to drop. And the question is, why suddenly is that bushel of corn that you were selling for $5 a bushel, you're now selling it for 75 cents a bushel, 50 cents a bushel, 25 cents a bushel? And the answer is, and you should draw a line off the side, you're going to add this in as a side oral note, is because primarily because Europe doesn't need our crops anymore. Because by the mid-1920s, what happens is now these European farms, especially in France, in Belgium, where the Western Front was located. You're going to learn about the Western Front when we talk about World War I. Those farms which had been decimated as a result of the Great War, the land has a magical way of restoring itself. And now the European farmers, the French farmers, the Belgian farmers are starting to once again farm the land. And guess what? They don't need American crops the way they once had. And so no wonder Ma and Pa farmer and American Gothic are unhappy. So now you say, well, why is this a problem? Well, it's real simple. If I'm only selling that bushel of corn or wheat for 75 cents or 50 cents or 25 cents a bushel, remember, a farmer makes money dependent upon how much they sell their crops for. And if you're not selling it for what you expected, farmers have bills to pay too. Absolutely. The mortgage on the farm itself, the land. What about your home? What about your equipment? You use credit to buy it. How are you going to pay your bills if you're not selling those crops for a certain profit? This is going to be a huge problem. All right, please write this down. So now let's talk about organized labor. They also, the Roaring Twenties, at the beginning of the decade were pretty good, but by the middle of the decade, not so much after all. So how are things going for organized labor, especially your labor unions? And when I think of the labor unions, the one in particular, so remember, Knights of Labor at this point was gone. It's really primarily the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, founded by and still led by Samuel Gompers, and the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, Eugene Vicker Debs, is still going strongly. So if you would write this down. So during World War I, the wages of organized laborers was actually increasing. So the question again is why? Why were the wages going up? So once again, I would draw a line off the side where you wrote why. You're going to add in a side oral note. And the answer is World War I. Because again, Europeans, our allies, the Brits and the French, need American goods. They're fighting a war against the Central Powers. And so now you've got American manufacturers cranking out goods that the Europeans need, shipping it over to Europe, exporting, I should say more specifically. And as a result, the wages of the workers is going up. So in this regards, economically speaking, the war was actually benefiting American labor. Now, please write this down, but look what happens. By the mid-1920s, now we're talking 1923, 1924, 1925. Now suddenly the wages of American workers, especially in organized labor, is becoming what we call status quo. Status quo is Latin. You should draw a line off the side to clarify this. Maybe I'll mention this on your next progress check. Status quo means basically stays the same. So now your wages are starting to level off. But at the same time, while your wages are staying status quo, but goods continue to go up in price. And so how can you afford these goods? How can you afford to be able to maintain your standard of living if your wages are not keeping up with the cost of living? Number two, what you start to notice is we actually went into a recession in the early 1920s, 1920, 1921, 1922. And what's going to notice in this recession, a recession is simply an economic period where the economy is not doing well. It's sick. I'm going to speak metaphorically. And so what happens is jobs are going to be cut. Now you got to understand, in those days, there was no unemployment compensation like we have today, or during COVID, when the government was providing people additional funds to be able to subside because jobs were being lost as a result of the pandemic. That's not the way it was over 100 years ago. So the end result is, as these jobs are being cut in this economic recession in the early 1920s, you start to see unemployment's going up. That means workers are not working. No unemployment compensation, no Social Security. That's years and years into the future. So now this is what you're going to start to see more of. Photographs like this that was taken in the early 1920s. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to temporarily pause my Zoomcast. I want you to study this photograph, and I want you to draw a line off to the side. This should take you 30 seconds to do. In this photograph, tell me, this is called a queue, a line of individuals. Why are they all lined up? There is a clue somewhere in this photograph. You need to recognize it. Why are they all lined up? And I want you to tell me what the clue is that tells you what they were actually doing. I, of course, am going to continue on my Zoomcast. So now we've talked about political changes, women gaining the right to vote through the 19th Amendment, huge. Tried to pass the Equal Rights Amendment with Alice Paul, but that was never ratified. It's still out there today in 2021. You learn about economic changes. Again, more and more Americans are heavily investing in the stock market. Remember, it was mostly a bull market. The value of stocks keeps going up. More and more Americans, of course, were also, again, using credit. So now let's talk about some of the social changes that were going on during the Roaring '20s, 100 years ago. So number one, this was a huge, it's not only a political change, but I call it a social change. And I call it political because this was an amendment to the Constitution, and it's called the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment, of course, was called Prohibition. This was considered to be the last significant action taken during the Progressive era. Prohibition, you should draw a line off to the side for additional clarification, is basically the prohibiting of alcoholic substances, beverages, beer, hard liquors, wine, etc. So then, shortly after the 18th Amendment was ratified by both houses of Congress and, of course, by the states as well, then you have the passing of what's called the Volstead Act. The Volstead Act, again, passed by Congress, signed into law by then President Woodrow Wilson. What the Volstead Act did, and you should draw a line off to the side for further clarification. Remember, the Volstead Act, all it did was it enforced the 18th Amendment. So these two go together. They both deal with the same thing, prohibition, the prohibiting of the consumption, the distribution, the manufacturing of alcoholic beverages. There were some exceptions, which we'll talk about later, but the Volstead Act basically gave the federal government the teeth, the power to be able to enforce it. Let's continue on. If you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, these gentlemen are called G-men. They're government agents. And what they've discovered are these illegal barrels of alcoholic beverages. And what they're doing is, if you notice, they open up the barrels and they're dumping the alcohol down a sewer drain. And again, this is going to play a huge role during the Roaring '20s, as we're going to find out a little bit more. So I want everybody to skip a full page, and I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. We're going to come back to those notes, don't worry. I want you to, again, date your notes for today is October 15, 2021. And I want you to write down for me guide questions, 18th Amendment. So once again, I'm going to share another video clip with you. And I think it's really important you understand a little bit more about the 18th Amendment. Again, ratified initially by, again, Congress and the states. And then you have the Volstead Act, which was signed by President Woodrow Wilson, which enforces it. It has a dramatic impact on the Roaring '20s. All right, some guide questions. And I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. And again, pause the Zoomcast because you're not going to be able to keep up. And that's okay. That's the beauty of these Zoomcasts. Number one, hey, what role did the Anti-Saloon League play in what's called the temperance movement? The temperance movement, actually, its origins goes back to the Progressive era, 1901 1921. I would argue in a good way that the temperance movement actually traces its roots back before the progressive era. This is really considered to be the last great significant action of the progressive era. Skip a line or two. And again, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because you can pause the Zoomcast. There we go. Number 2. According to the progressives, how would prohibition, the prohibiting of alcoholic beverages to be consumed, sold, distributed, manufactured, etc., how would it improve society? Number 3, whenever I think of prohibition, there's one person I think about, and her name was Carrie Nation. Who is Carrie Nation? Next guy question. Could you tell me a little more about the 18th Amendment? So I just introduced it. I was a little bit vague. I gave you just a general description. Now the video is going to fill in the pieces, if you will, fill in the gaps. Next guy question. How many states were needed to ratify the 18th Amendment? Remember, for an amendment to be added to the Constitution of the United States of America, you have to have, again, so many states approve, and you also have to have both houses of Congress, the House of Reps, the lower house, and the Senate as well, all on board. Next guy question. What state became the 36th state to ratify the 18th Amendment to the Constitution? Prohibition. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so I'm now going to start this video clip. This is, again, a short one. It's about 2 minutes and 46 seconds long. Ladies and gentlemen, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. So even though it wasn't ratified in the Roaring '20s, but it has a huge, huge social economic impact on this decade. Here we go.
Hello and welcome to History Pod. On the 16th of January 1919, Nebraska became the vital 36th of the 48 states to approve the 18th Amendment, which introduced prohibition. By the late 19th century, the temperance movement in the United States had grown to include a number of organizations that sought to dramatically reduce, and in some cases, completely stop the consumption of alcohol. It was seen as the root cause of a number of the social problems that activists who flourished in the progressive era sought to address. Although some individual counties and states had begun to introduce alcohol controls, the emergence of the Anti-Saloon League as a national organization saw the arrival of powerful and coordinated lobbying. In 1906, the ASL began a major campaign to encourage states to ban the sale of alcohol by making speeches, taking out advertisements, and staging public demonstrations. All these methods sought to promote the view that prohibition would improve society by eliminating poverty, violence, and antisocial behavior. The campaign also saw occasional violent action by more radical campaigners, such as Carrie Amelia Moore Nation, who became well known for vandalizing saloons and smashing kegs of alcohol. By 1916, almost half the states in America had already introduced laws against saloons. In December the following year, the 18th Amendment, which would prohibit the manufacture, sale, or transport of alcoholic beverages, comfortably passed both chambers in Congress. However, it would need to be ratified by at least 3/4 of the states in order to pass into law. It wasn't until the 16th of January 1919 that Nebraska became the 36th to ratify the amendment. Nationwide prohibition began on the 17th of January the following year and existed until its repeal by the 21st Amendment in 1933.
So a couple of takeaways about prohibition. Number one, it is the only amendment to the Constitution, as the gentleman mentioned, that was actually repealed by another amendment, which was the 21st Amendment. Number two, again, for an amendment to be ratified, you have to have 3/4, 75% of the states have to ratify it in order for it to be added to the United States Constitution, okay? Number three, There were legal ways in the 1920s to get around prohibition, the 18th Amendment, which was enforced by the Volstead Act. So you could, for example, religious reasons, like, for example, in Christianity or in Judaism, again, wine is part of a service. So you could still manufacture wine if it was done for religious purposes. Number two, you also could do it for medicinal purposes. If you could get your pharmacist or your doctor to write you a prescription, you could legally consume alcohol. And number three, you could actually be able to manufacture it on your own, but you only would be able to drink it by yourself. You wouldn't be able to go outside. You weren't supposed to go outside and drink it with your neighbor. So there were legal ways you could get around prohibition. But the reality of the matter is most people just did it illegally anyway. They would go to what are called speakeasies. Speakeasies are these illegal bars that would be set up at the back of a floral shop. As a matter of fact, my daughter-in-law's brother owns a home in Oak Park, Illinois. He moved into it a couple months ago, and he discovered in his basement a secret speakeasy. His home is over 100 years old. And it was actually a separate hidden room that people used to gather in to illegally drink alcohol. So everybody knew where the alcohol was. Everybody was drinking it illegally. The cops were still doing it. The politicians were doing it. It was, again, the main purpose behind prohibition was, again, people like Harry Nation thought if you get rid of the alcohol, you would eliminate a lot of the abuses that were going on in families. The problem was the abuses did not subside. More people continued drinking alcohol, more and more illegal activity, like, again, gangsters like Al Capone were making lots of money off of what they call bootlegging, the illegal distribution of alcohol. And finally, in 1933, again, eventually, prohibition, the 18th Amendment, became the only amendment to the Constitution that was officially repealed. It just simply was a social experiment that simply did not work. All right, so as we wrap up my direct instructional Zoomcast, I want you to write this down for me. So I want you to go backwards to the previous page of notes, and I want to talk about some inventions that are going to change the lives of the American people. So today, when you think about inventions, you're thinking about the newest earbuds or headphones or cell phones or TVs, etc. But in the Roaring '20s, 100 years ago, it was different. It was more in terms of inventions like, for example, the refrigerator. Great example. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, that is a photograph of what people used to use before refrigerators were introduced, and that's called an ice box. So you would have to go and you would have to have an iceman or the icemen come, deliver chunks of ice to put inside the ice box, and that's where you would keep your perishables from, again, becoming bad. But now, in the Roaring '20s, you have a refrigerator. So all you got to do now is you just have to simply plug it into an electric outlet. You don't need to call the iceman anymore. And basically, all your food is good to go. So here's my final question I have for everybody as we wrap up my celebration of learning. Both of these things, the icebox and refrigerator, both do the same thing. They preserve food so they don't spoil. So my question is, what do you see is the biggest benefit from having a refrigerator as compared to an icebox? So I want you to draw a line off to the side, take about a minute, and I want you to briefly explain for me why the refrigerator became so popular in the Roaring '20s and why it eventually replaced the icebox as the main means of preserving food and not allowing it to spoil. So there you have it, sports fans. So that is my direct instruction, of course, for today, October 15th, 2021. So again, what I'm going to do is for my next direct instructional Zoomcast, I'm going to be talking about some other inventions besides the refrigerator that's going to really change the lives of the American people. I mean, I don't think about my refrigerator at home in Roselle. I'm sure you don't either, but that was a big deal to people living 100 years ago. These inventions are going to change people's lives, and it's going to give people something, I won't say yet, that they didn't enjoy previously, their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents. So here's what I want you to do. Take out your correctable tape now. You're going to go and you're going to clean up anything you crossed out or traced over. I need multiple colored highlighters, not just one. Remember, use the tip of the tip and focus on those words you can visualize in your mind, your persons, your places, and your things. And remember, you had 2 video clips. Highlight not just your notes, but the guide questions. If you're not doing it, you're not reinforcing this information, and that's not giving you the mastery you need to be successful on future assessments. Remember, you need to go and review your ISN 10 to 15 minutes every day. You practice for basketball, you practice for soccer, you never complain about it. That's how you develop that skill. Why aren't you practicing for school every single day? It's the same thing. That's how you truly get in shape, not physically, but mentally and emotionally. And remember, if you have an opportunity, hand your ISN to somebody in your house, your mom, your dad, a brother or sister that had me previously, maybe an aunt or an uncle that had me decades ago. And you channel the inner Mr. Bonk. You teach them about the stock market. What is a stock or a share? What is a bull market? What is a bear market? Why were more and more Americans in the roaring 20s buying stocks in the stock market? And why was it so dangerous what they were doing? Talk about some of the social changes. What was Prohibition? Who was Carrie Nation? What did the progressives believe that Prohibition would eventually do if it was done properly? How did people get around Prohibition? What eventually happened to the 18th Amendment? And then finally, talk about the refrigerator and why you think a refrigerator is better than an icebox, even though they both do basically the same thing. And if you can do that, that's truly how you develop a greater understanding and mastery of the information. Remember, master, don't memorize. So again, I hope you enjoyed the Zoomcast as much as I enjoyed making it. I'm going to continue doing it for the duration of the school year because, again, you're in charge of your pace. You're in charge of your learning. And as I always like to say, ladies and gentlemen, as I wrap up every single Zoomcast, you know, the story may have ended today, but you know the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you. And please be well.